Heaven's River by Dennis E. Taylor. And ooh boy, is this a big one. Not just the book, which is big enough in its own right. It's at 600 pages, I think it is. 600 or thereabouts. 609, in fact, pages. Not only big in that regard, there's a lot to go through with it. And it's partly because it's book 4 in the Bobiverse. Let's talk about the cover art for a second. The cover art is done by Jeff Brown Graphics, and if you haven't heard of them, I think you should probably check out their website. You probably have if you read fantasy and science fiction. Looks like they've done a lot of fantasy covers. They also did one for the Three Body Problem. Great website, and they proudly state that none of their artwork is AI generated, which is kind of amusing when you're doing one for the Bobiverse where AI is a big deal. Now, my understanding of this series by Taylor is that when it was first released, it was only released electronically. And at the time, I did not read it, even though I got a lot of pressure from a couple of directions to read it, because I don't read electronically for pleasure. Now, it was so successful, as I understand it, again, that it ended up being released in carbon-based life form, what I like to call real books, though of course audiobooks are real books, etc., but carbon-based life forms. And I started the series about a year ago. Now, I read the first 2 with a bit of a gap. I read the 3rd after that. It's been 9 months since my last Bobiverse experience, and I'll try to remember to put the links in the description below. This number 4, in my opinion, should not be read as a solo. It should only be read after having read the others. Small dinosaur, we are not chewing books, are we? No, we don't chew books. We don't chew books. Come here. Say hello to the camera. Right, where was I? Okay, so this number 4 doesn't work as a standalone, and it is actually, I'm going to say, a little bit tricky to review without the others, so I'm going to have to do a bit of an introduction recap. In the first book, we are Legion, we are Bob, who is actually Robert Johansson, a geek of mass proportions and a software developer. After his death, he's cryogenically stored and awakened after a significant social change has occurred. So instead of being cured and released a wealthy man into society, his brain has been incorporated without his consent into tech to become a von Neumann probe, with the ability to explore the galaxy and also with the ability to self-replicate more Bobs. Hence the title, We Are Legion, and I loved that book so much. In number 2, For We Are Many, is 40 years on into Bobby space after the first book, and there are multiple Bobs now because Bob has replicated himself multiple times, and each one of them is going off in different directions, doing different things, experiencing different worlds, and doing other challenge. A major challenge for and plot thread for book number 2 is the fact that the human race seems bent on wiping itself out, devastating the planet and sending it into a nuclear winter. The Bobs are equally determined to save the human race, whether they like it or not. And you have some really humorous interplays on the fact that they're trying to help and it isn't being appreciated. And that was a really good book as well. So also in Bob news for book 2, they encountered the others. This is an alien species which remains very alien. I like the fact that not all aliens become relatable by humans. The aliens remain alien. It's a species that is bent on stripping all metals off every planet that they encounter, and hence ending all life. They regard the life as meat, I believe, and they strip all the metals until there's nothing left of a planet or a system entirely. So the others make the Borg in Star Trek look warm, cuddly and fuzzy, and the Bobs have to deal with the others And part of their worry about the extinction of the human race is that the others on their projected trajectory will reach there eventually. Now, the original Bob, meanwhile, has become fascinated by an alien race, and rather than going on to explore the galaxy, has stayed to become their protective sky god, which isn't a problem when really you have no anticipated end of life, because as a replicant, as they call themselves, they can do things like create manually operated manis, they call them. Let's just call them manis. Insert yourself into them, go down to the surface, become one of the natives, and so forth. And I love the way the early books develop all this technology, and they talk about how he gets the tech together to make these factories to self-replicate and create drones, and all the descriptions of the communication systems and everything. They're all good. And I loved number 2 as well. So book number 3, All These Worlds. I went straight on to number 3 from number 2, and I should probably have rested in between. I find that I often enjoy series more if I give them some time to sort of ferment in my brain and read something else and come back to them. So I had been told that All These Worlds was a bit different to the previous 2, and it was, in that we were concentrating less on the expansion of new Bobs and more on world universe affairs. There was a lot more conflict in number 3, even combativeness, and that has continued on till number 4, which has more, though different, if not altercations, at least combativeness. Okay, that's the best word, really. And I get that if you are creating a book, you need to have something to push against or there's no plot. So, yes, back to number 3. The highlights to number 3 were the ongoing conflict with the others, which story arc seems to conclude with that book, including a couple of really interesting side effects that I'm not going to mention, because you may not have read it at this stage. I didn't adore number 3 quite as much as the other 2. It didn't feel as tight a story to me. I think it was also a slightly larger book, but it didn't feel like the story flowed as continuously. I thought it had a few stops and starts. And because of that, I gave it a little bit more of a rest. That's 9-month rest before I started Heaven's River. Now in Heaven's River, we go back to the original Bob, and he's decided to go off searching for one of the original cohort Bob, who was called Bender, and set off to reach the stars 100 years ago and then was never heard from again. So in this book we have a lot of the original cohort. One of them, they all gave themselves geeky names, which is great. You have Will Riker. Will is still there, but he's dropped the Riker by Heaven's River. Bender, I think most people with geek creds will get where Bender came from. But you also have geekness from outside the more obvious science fiction sphere, which is one thing I really do love about Dennis E. Taylor's writing. 2 of the Bobs called themselves Icarus and Daedalus, and they're the ones that headed off for the stars, which is what all of them were originally wanting to do. And when the original Bob bonded with a member of an alien species on another planet, he called him Archimedes because he was such an inventor. So Greek geek as well as SF geek. It's like, yes, bring it on. Anyway, back to Bender. There's a lot, by the way, of Simpsons, that one that spin off from The Simpsons where Bender was in. Oh, you know. I'm sure you remember it better than I do. So Bender set off, no one heard from him again, and with their evolved technology they should have, because as they discovered new technology, they were beaming it to the places where all these Bobs who've set off were going to arrive at. So I'm pretty sure it's Icarus and Daedalus set off before they had long-distance communications, but as these communications became available, Bob created an extended communications system that everyone could use. They extended a huge virtual reality system where everyone could pop in and out of other people's virtual realities, and the virtual realities were very much amenable to change. So the original one was a library with a Jeeves the butler to serve coffee. But then they extended, one person tries to extend his virtual reality to cover every single science fiction movie that the Bobs have ever loved, etc. There's a lot. There's a lot of joy and geekish goodness in these books that I'm not going into. There's even more, heaps more. Rightio. So tracing Bender. The way Bob does this is to trace his the energy signature of his ship heading out. And this trail leads him through some tribulations to a system with a planet which has been devastated by nuclear and biological warfare. By the way, up to now, I haven't really done any spoilers, and I don't plan to until I've given an outline of the plot. Then I'm going to say spoilers. If you're reading it, or if you're going to read it, flake off, finish reading, come back. Okay, follows Bender's trail to this system. We've got a planet that's clearly been devastated by an intelligent race warfare of the sort that humans were trying to inflict upon each other in a previous book. You've had nuclear warfare because you can tell by the radiation. You've had biological warfare because you can tell by various things. In this system also, there is a manufactured artificial habitat. Now, it's not Ringworld, as imagined by Larry Niven, but it's a topopolis, which I hadn't heard of before. But this book and Wikipedia both will tell you that a topopolis is basically a tube-shaped space habitat module. It goes in a ring, but instead of having a flat surface, it's all self-contained. This particular topopolis has added features, lots of added features, and it is basically one long river running all the way through, because the species of this system ends up being freshwater aquatic. Not entirely, partially aquatic. Anyway, so I think the author really loved Ringworld. There's a lot of Ringworld references in this book, and having read Ringworld just recently with Ira over on SF Words of Wonder, I loved those parts. There was lots of them. Okay, moving on. Bob and a few more Bobs create manis that realistically resemble the alien species in the topopolis in Heaven's River, and they go down into the habitat to look for Bender. There's good reasons why they do that. It's a huge topopolis. The ability to scan it from elsewhere isn't really available to them. There's issues. There is clearly an element of aggression because probes that were sent to investigate got exploded. They've found out that Bender's spaceship also got exploded, but they have reason to think that he might be down there. So, well, they can't go down in a group of 4 because they've found out from biological and sociological examination of the species, as well as language studies, that it's common for young Quinlans to form a group, most often 4 Quinlans, to go out and explore, and so they do that. Now, while they're doing that and exploring the topopolis and looking for Bender, there's this seething unrest in the Bobiverse. So now we've reached the point where there's 24 generations of Bobs onward, there's distinct factions arising, and there is drift, there is personality drift, that's it. Personality drift, character drift, whatever, there's a lot. Some of these alternative groups are combative, have different opinions, and they lack cohesion as a Bobiverse like they did in the first few books. Very much so. In ways that are unlikely. Even in the earlier books, when there were a lot of Bobs, after number 2 or 3, I think they gave you a list of all the Bobs and what their relationship was. So it's like a family tree. You started with Bob, and he split into 2 or 3. Each one of these, one of them was Riker. Will is still around. They then split into multiple Bobs, and each one of these splits into multiple Bobs, and by now we are 24 generations down, and there's a lot of Bobs. Way more than I could possibly remember, even without a family tree. And give Taylor credit for that. He never expects you to. He gives you this wealth of Bobiverse without expecting you to know all it. It concentrates on a small number of Bobs, most of them from the original cohort. So, what did I think of this book overall? I liked it. Yes, I did really like it. I read it quite fast. I enjoyed it. I never didn't want to come back to it. I didn't, however, think it was anywhere near as tight as the earlier books. The first two definitely, and even the third, you had a tight, strong story that never really drifted. This one felt like it drifted a lot. It felt like Taylor could have used an editor to say, nah, you're repeating yourself. Squash that word count. That's just me. I am not necessarily in the majority on this, but that was my feeling. I also was not wild about the ending. Many people were. Many people loved this ending. I was not one of them. It felt, in many regards, like it failed to take failed to fully avail itself of the opportunities for a satisfying conclusion. And it felt very much like it was a prequel for the next book and a beg to go off and buy it. The next book is already out, so yeah. However, complaints aside, I did really like it. Once again, it is a book by a geek, for geeks, and this is an omnivorous geek. Like I said, we're not just talking about Trekkies and The Simpsons. We are talking about Greek mythology. We are talking about a lot of STEM science. So there's a lot of science and technology in there. And it's used more, whether he uses it more, whether he uses it less, he uses it in interesting ways. Exactly what we want from our science fiction. We want people to take actual science concepts and expand them into speculative fiction. And he does that very, very well. Yeah, so all the different geekdoms of the SFs and D&D. I don't play D&D anymore, but I did for many years. My dice are still behind me on the shelf. I could never part from them somehow. And in Heaven's River, there's one group that are the gamers, and they basically spend most of their time in virtual reality, or VERT, as they call it, playing Dungeons and Dragons games. He doesn't go into that a lot, so if you're not a D&D fan, it won't hurt you, it won't burn. But for those of us who remember with joy romping around dungeons, killing and getting killed, and picking up treasure, it's a lot of fun. And it's funny. That's the thing about Dennis E. Taylor that will see you through all the bits that aren't as good. The sense of humour is strong and very enjoyable. So, another thing about all of these Bobiverse books that I've read is that it feels, though it's got these words and phrases and it's got this tone that makes there's a sort of thing that you evolve with your nearest and dearest. You know, those tiny references that you make in public, only certain people will understand them. If you're dating the wrong person and they're sitting on the other side of the dinner table and they go home after dinner and they say, I can't follow what you guys are talking about, might not be the one for you. Or maybe just hand them a reading list and they might end up being. For example, of the things that I really enjoy about that is the way he uses words. Like on page 175, he says referencitis, to refer to a Bob that keeps referencing things. That's surely not a real word, but it's instantly recognizable, and for me, instantly relatable. And most of my friends probably as well. So as an SFF writer, or as a geek, you may have a moral obligation, maybe, to even at least try some of the first of the Bobiverses. But start from number 1, and this one is number 4, and it is spoiler time. So, what did I love? I loved the extensive exploration of Heaven's River with the sabbatical of 4 Quinlans. This is, if you've read it, you will probably be with me on this, because a large portion of this book is Bob goes down into a pre-made Manny that is like this semi-aquatic otter, only with an expanding tail that swims underwater. Of the 4 that go down, one of them is Bridget, which was great because Bridget is a biologist, a zoologist. She and her partner Bob have spent many, many lifetimes, mapping different extraterrestrial, so she says xenobiologists, basically. Now, because they've done so much preliminary sociology studies and language studies using various surveillance droids, it's easy to slip into the world of Heaven's River, and it feels real, but you've been given the explanation for why it works so well. You'd really need an explanation for someone fitting into a world that well. And basically, what this Topopolis is this big hose shape with the river running all the way through it. It's divided into segments that are hard but not impossible to cross. And in order to search for Bender without being obvious, without alerting whoever it is that's exploding their drones, they pretend to be Quinlans. There's so many things that are great about that, like the way that they can float downstream when they leave one town, the four of them just floating on the river, holding each other's hands and feet like otters do. It's cute, warm and fuzzy. But these Quinlans aren't warm and fuzzy. They are incredibly combative. They are even more argumentative and more inclined to fight than a group of pick your heavy drinking human nationality outside a pub of a Friday evening. There's a lot of explanations for that, and the explanations are great. And if I had one complaint with the early books, is that Taylor wasn't really giving me as much biology, as much zoology, about as much xenomorphology as I would have liked. And in Heaven's River, I get the biological and the ecological that was missing from earlier books, and I love that. I still do not love what the author did with Howard and Bridget. Last time it felt like Howard and Bridget relationship was just a way to get a girl as a replicate into the Bobiverse, first female on board, etc., etc. In this book, it felt more like Howard doesn't really exist as a Bob entity. He's just there to bring Bridget into the story arc. And I thought that was very cursory. I also thought that there were many other things in there that were glanced off the same way. No book's going to be perfect, even with 609 pages to play with. Not really complaining. Okay, I do really enjoy the explanations for names. Of all the science fiction books that I've read that don't give you strange names with 200 different syllables and strange apostrophes in places, Taylor has the best and most logical name for why an otter-like creature who evolved in Etaloporus system could be called Teresa. It is instantly believable, it's funny, it's relatable, and it means you can actually tell the characters apart without needing to make notes. Love that. Also love, there is a lot of science, especially the harder STEM sciences, but like I said, more ecology, more soft sciences as well. My jam. But you've got notions like physics, from engineering, from astrophysics, from computer science, lots of those, because Taylor is an ex-computer person, and maths. But he mostly concentrates on the possibilities. Now, I love all those sciences, but I don't understand them terribly well, and I never studied them, so I can't always follow the really hard science books. Here, Taylor does a great balancing act. He gives you just enough to intrigue you, to keep you involved, to make you maybe go out and Google what something means. If you're actually in those sciences, you've probably got enough to be really thrilled that someone else has heard of your pet theory that I've forgotten. Anyway, I think he does that really well. For example, you've got the Singularity Project. That's a group of Bobs that have moved off. They're trying to build a Matryoshka brain, which is a hypothetical megastructure of immense computational capacity. So essentially that seems to be an AI in effect, and their point is that there's questions about the universe that they can't answer with an AI. I don't love where that group went in the end, and I certainly don't love how they went about it, and I don't like how Dennis E. Taylor incorporated that. I think that could have been better done, but whatever. There's also a group called the Trekkies who are going really stick up the arse and trying to enact the Prime Directive and stop the Bobs from interacting with the biological people. Which brings us to the divergence of the different groups of Bobs due to personality drifts. A plot choice with pros and cons. I think he had to do it. There were too many to remain relevant or memorable, and way too many to logically still have an autonomous group. But it ends up in the War of the Bobs with people bombing each other and doing computer hacking raids and all the rest of it. The conflicts took a large element of the fun out of the series for me. They introduced an element of doom and gloom. It's not what I love the original books for. I can see that going forward in the series, which I don't know how long he's planning it for, you needed that sort of conflict, but still didn't love it. Skippies and Trekkies and gamers. I love the virtual D&D gamers. Now, back to the main plot, which is not in space, but exploring the structure. That exploration... Man, this is a long video. That exploration originally was great, because we had this group of 4 on their sabbatical. Bridget was one. She gave the bio background. Bob was another. He brought the humour into it. There were a couple of others, whoever they were. Garfield was one, I think. And that was great. It was really good. You had all these characters, they could interact, there were conversations, there were different things happening. Great story, great travel story. But later on, after the other Bobs enact a science war, these people can no longer come into virtual reality to go down to their mannies and be on the surface. At this point, we've got Bob running around on his own trying to rescue Bender, which he doesn't eventually do, spoiler. And I think that bit could have been edited a lot. You didn't have the conversations, you didn't have the interactions, you had Bob running around. Running through the rivers, running through the forest, this, that, and the other. There were some really high points, like when he evicts a combative badger from his den to escape the people who are after him. But it felt like it could have been edited a lot. To me, it felt like that. It felt there was a lot of repetition. There was often no real story progression. You had a lot of times it felt conflated. And even the regular popping in and out of Vert to have conversations with people did not make up for the group dynamics I was missing at all. No group dynamics until Hugh appeared. Right. Now, if you've read this, if you haven't read this and you plan to, you shouldn't be here. You should have stopped a while back. But if you have read this, hands up anyone who did not see the plot twist of the Trekkies coming. Hands up anyone who did not see Hugh as being a less than 100% honest character. Hands up anyone who didn't see someone else being behind the Trekkies and go, I wonder. I don't see any hands up. And of course you saw it coming. If I saw it coming, pretty sure that everyone in the universe from the age of 4 up would see it coming. I don't see things coming. And I'm pretty sure that Taylor was telegraphing 6 ways from Sunday how this was going down, and I didn't love it, and I didn't see the point, and having finished the book, I still don't see the point of that, unless it's a point that's going to be completed in a subsequent book, and I've got opinions about that. Which takes me on to my small rant about the ending. Over 600 pages, mostly concerned with getting Bender back, which they do. And there's some great stuff there. There's some great things about how the Topopolis is a tube inside another tube, and that you've got elevators and there's mass transport systems that the inhabitants no longer use. You've got the AI in control of this whole Topopolis, and anyone who didn't see what that AI was going to be about for the Skippy Trekkie plot, hand in your SF badge. No, don't. Just keep reading. Yeah, that was a bit of a pain. It's like that was too heavily telegraphed. It was too obvious. I thought it was a pain. So, 600 pages, mostly concerned with getting Bender back, running around the world with Hugh and him trying to keep Bender's casing out of the hands of Quinlans, who are very metal poor and would rip it apart, killing Bender, or getting it submerged and soaked, which they don't think that Bender can survive. They finally get back into the Bobiverse through a mechanism of Hugh's that, you know what? It was a choice that Taylor made. I'm not an author. It was a choice. Anyway. Yeah, so he gets back to the Bobiverse. He sits down in virtual reality with Bob, who tells him that there's a lot more now to the Bobiverse than there was 100 years ago. He has a coffee after 100 years with no coffee. And then the people that have been going above and beyond to rescue him for most of these 600 pages pop into the Vert and it's like, hey, how you doing? And then they start talking about all the political affairs in the Bobiverse. They don't really talk to Bender very much, and Bender doesn't talk to them. If he finishes coffee and he goes, hey, bye, guys, I'm going to meet the other boys in the pub. And that's it. Anticlimactic much? I mean, 600 pages trying to get this guy back. I'm not sure there's ever more than, hey, thanks for doing that. I was about to go insane, closed in a small box with no stimulus. Hey, yeah. Oh yeah, I'll have coffee. I'll go away now. It's like, oh, bye guy. We only spent the last however many years suffering to get you back. It's like, oh. There is anticlimactic, and then there is this. Beyond anticlimactic. Words fail me. So that happens, and then there's a moot, and then we discover the bad guys aren't exactly who we thought, but they've gone away. The new bad guys who sponsored the bad guys do a thing, which is also, I'm going to say, really heavily anticlimactic. It feels like it's building up for the next book. And then there's the real end, right at the end, the last page or two, when Bob goes back to Heaven's River, which they've agreed with the AI they're allowed to do. He goes into his manny and he goes to one place to visit the really old otter called Teresa, with who he bonded on a ship while he was trying to escape with Bender. Now, maybe he just called to have that conversation that she said she hoped they'd have one day, where they could talk more about their world and his, because she'd figured out that he wasn't a Quinlan. He knew too many scientific theories, and then there were others he didn't know. He had too many sociology, like the golden rules that the Quinlan have are different, and Bob opened his trap and betrayed the fact that he didn't know how they worked. So she was old and she didn't care, and she was an ex-university professor in Quinlanverse. She was just curious, so Bob goes back to her house and they sit down to learn more about each other's world. Now, maybe he just called to tell her all that stuff. The strong implication is that she will be the first non-human replicant in the next book, so instead of dying, she will be given a replicant in the universe, like Bridget was, because Howard couldn't live without her. So it's a good book. I enjoyed it. Not my favourite from the series. Very glad I read it. I don't think it kept its story together as tightly as previously. I get that Taylor is now planning a long-running extended series, and there's a lot of setting up for conflicts, etc. in the future, and all the different groups that we're going to need in the next book, which is already out. So don't let any of this put you off, because there's more. I have a long-standing grudge against books that, having finished them, I'm not really given an ending. I think that's a money grab for me to buy the next book, and I tend to get sulky and aggro about it. So I'm a bit sulky and aggro about the ending of this one, I've got to admit. It's not a bad ending, it's just not a Deb ending. That's all I can really say about that. Will I buy the next one? No, but I probably will get it from the library. I'm going to give it a few months. I do miss the tight, strong plot and the 100% of enjoyability of the first couple. After resting with lowered expectations, I expect I probably will enjoy the next one very much. I enjoyed this one very much. I just tend to save my criticisms for the end. Yeah, good on you, Dennis E. Taylor, for bringing a geekyverse for geeks of excellent science fiction into a world where I'm gonna say I don't think I can think of any other science fiction writers who are actually doing what the Bobiverse does in so many ways. The exploration, the technology, the limitless horizons, and the slow exploration of individual worlds and situations book by book. I hope that number 5 has an actual ending for me. And if it doesn't, in the very unlikely event that Dennis Taylor ever sees this, please, Taylor, start giving me endings that actually end. That Bender story arc ending was a completely missed opportunity. And Teresa, foreshadowing is foreshadowing. Give me endings, but also give me many more good books like this. Thank you for watching.